The plane hit the mountain so hard that the sightseeing trip ended before most of the passengers understood they were going down. One moment, the Gremlin Special was banking through clouds above a hidden green valley in New Guinea. The next, metal tore through trees, bodies slammed forward, and fire moved through the wreckage. Lieutenant John McCollom came to in a nightmare of broken aluminum, smoke, and screaming. Around him were people who had climbed aboard expecting an hour above a place American flyers had nicknamed Shangri-La. Now the C-47 lay smashed against a mountainside high above the valley floor, with the living trapped among the dead. It was May 13th, 1945. The war in Europe had just ended, but in the Pacific, American service members stationed around Hollandia, in Dutch New Guinea, were still far from home. New Guinea was one of the hardest places Allied airmen knew. Mountains rose suddenly into clouds. Jungle swallowed wreckage whole. Weather changed without warning. Pilots called it a graveyard for aircraft because so many planes had gone missing there and were never found. The Gremlin Special was a Douglas C-47 Skytrain, a U.S. Army Air Force's transport plane. That morning, 24 men and women boarded for a morale flight over the Balium Valley, a highland basin surrounded by mountains in the interior of western New Guinea. Pilots had seen the valley from the air and compared it to Shangri-La. From above, it looked isolated and green, with villages, gardens, and people whose lives were mostly unknown to the Americans flying over them. The aircraft left the Hollandia area and flew toward the mountains. Passengers looked through the windows as jungle, ridges, and cloud banks passed beneath them. But the closer the plane came to the valley, the more dangerous the terrain became. Clouds hung low around the peaks. The ridges were steep, high, and unforgiving. As the Gremlin Special circled near the valley, visibility became a problem. The pilot descended to give the passengers a better view, but the aircraft was trapped by weather and terrain. Within moments, the C-47 slammed into the side of a mountain. The impact killed most of the people aboard instantly. 5 people survived the crash at first. They were badly injured and surrounded by wreckage in a place no rescue crew could reach by road. 2 of them, Sergeant Laura Besley and Private Eleanor Hanna, lived through the first hours but died from their injuries before help arrived. That left 3, Margaret Hastings, Kenneth Decker, and John McCollom. Hastings was burned and cut. Decker was severely burned and injured. McCollom had fewer wounds than the others, but his twin brother Robert had died in the crash. The grief hit him while survival still demanded action. He could not stay in the wreckage. He had to move, help the others, and find a way to be seen. The survivors were high on a mountainside, with jungle below and the valley spread out beyond them. They had little food, few supplies, and no clear idea where they were. The dead lay in and around the wreckage. Smoke and fire marked the crash site, but clouds and terrain made it uncertain whether search planes would spot them before exposure, infection, or injury killed the living. When the Gremlin Special failed to return, search planes went out. For days, air crews scanned ridges, valleys, and jungle where a wreck could disappear beneath trees. On May 17th, 4 days after the crash, searchers finally spotted the wreckage and saw signs that people were alive. For Hastings, Decker, and McCollom, it meant they were not abandoned. But being found from the air was not the same as being rescued. The crash site was too remote for a normal landing. The valley was surrounded by mountains, and the jungle made a ground rescue nearly impossible. Japanese troops were still present in parts of New Guinea. The Americans also did not know how the local Dani and Yali people would react to outsiders appearing in their land. To the survivors, the valley below was both hope and uncertainty. The Army decided to send help by parachute. On May 26th, 2 medics from the 1st Filipino Infantry Regiment jumped into the area to reach the survivors. More paratroopers followed to protect and support the rescue effort. The men who landed had to find the crash survivors, treat burns and wounds, build a camp, and figure out how to get everyone out of a valley with no runway. The medics reached Hastings, Decker, and McCollom and began caring for them. Burns were cleaned and dressed. Food and supplies came by airdrop. The wounded no longer had to face the valley alone. But the rescue force had created a new problem. Now more Americans were trapped in the same isolated place. The local people soon approached. The Americans had been warned to fear them, and newspapers later used cruel language that turned the valley's residents into a spectacle. The reality on the ground was more human. The Dani and Yali people were cautious, armed, curious, and living in their own communities long before the Americans fell from the sky. Margaret Hastings became a focus of attention because she was the only surviving woman. Newspapers later called her the Queen of Shangri-La, a title that said more about outside fascination than about what she endured. In the valley, she was a wounded soldier trying to survive pain, heat, infection risk, and the emotional weight of knowing so many others from the flight were dead. Days stretched into weeks. The survivors lived in a camp while rescue planners considered options. Walking out through the jungle was too dangerous for the wounded. A conventional landing was impossible. Helicopters were not available for a rescue like this. The Army needed a way to pull people out of a valley where an aircraft could not safely land and take off. The answer was a glider snatch. Waco CG-4 gliders could be towed into the valley behind C-47 aircraft. A glider pilot would release, land on rough ground, load passengers, and then wait while a tow plane flew low overhead, trailing a hook system to catch a line attached to the glider. If it worked, the tow plane would yank the glider into the air and haul it back toward Hollandia. If it failed, the glider could crash or remain trapped. By late June, the plan was ready. On June 28th, 47 days after the Gremlin Special crashed, the rescue began. A glider came into the valley and landed hard on the rough field. The survivors knew this was their way out, but the method looked almost as dangerous as staying. There was no smooth runway. There was no guarantee the tow plane would catch the line cleanly. The rescue was carried out in separate lifts. Each time, a glider was loaded and prepared for pickup. The tow plane came in low, caught the line, and snapped the glider forward with violent force. The people inside were thrown into motion as the glider lurched across the ground and rose into the air. For the survivors who had already lived through one plane crash, being pulled back into the sky took nerve few people would ever have to prove. One by one, the trapped Americans were lifted out. Hastings, Decker, and McCollom left the valley alive. The medics and paratroopers who had jumped in to help them were brought out too. After 47 days of injury, grief, jungle isolation, and uncertainty, the Gremlin Special survivors returned to American hands. The story became famous because it sounded impossible. A plane crash in a hidden New Guinea valley, 3 survivors, contact with local people, and a rescue by glider from a place with no runway. But the real story was not adventure alone. It was the shock of impact, the smell of burned wreckage, the loss of 21 people, and 3 wounded survivors waiting day after day in a place the outside world barely understood. The Gremlin Special never returned from its sightseeing flight. Most of the people aboard never left the mountainside. But 3 came out alive because they held on long enough to be found, because medics jumped into danger to reach them, because local people did not become the threat outsiders feared, and because pilots found a way to pull human beings out of a valley that seemed determined to keep them. Thank you for listening to Horrifying Survival Stories. Subscribe for more stories of those who faced the impossible and lived.